Not again, not again, not again.
Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. In this podcast, we'll be talking to Barbara McCloskey about the art and life of George Grosz. The art of George Grosz, 1893 to 1959, provides bitterly satirical and hauntingly grotesque caricatures of the world in which he lived. Emerging out of the First World War, Grosz's drawings display absolute disdain for capitalists, military officials and politicians alike. A leading figure in movements such as German Expressionism, Dadaism and New Objectivity, George Grosz was a controversial figure who was denounced by the Nazis as Cultural Bolshevik #1. A member of the German Communist Party from 1919, George Grosz was nonetheless a controversial figure in the party itself. His biting satire seemed unable to fit with any institution or organisation. Following the rise of power of the Nazis in 1933, George Grosz emigrated to New York, where he became an anti-Stalinist, while his art confrontationally responded to New York's consensus around Surrealism and Abstract Expressionism. In many ways, the art and life of George Grosz displays a unique and challenging element in the social upheavals that surrounded him. In this session, we're joined by Barbara McCloskey. She is professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Her books include George Grosz and the Communist Party, Art and Radicalism in Crisis, 1918 to 1936, which was published in 1997, Artists of World War II, published in 2005, and The Exile of George Grosz, Modernism, America and the One World Order, 2015. In this session, she will be joining us to discuss her work on George Grosz, his provocative art, and the context in which he lived. The session was recorded on the 8th of September 2020 as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group, which meets fortnightly to discuss a range of topics loosely related to the history of the avant-garde, radical counterculture, and culture more generally. If you'd like to be involved, message us at explodingappendix@gmail.com. And if you'd like to check out more of our work, including some of our writings and other podcasts, please check out our website at www.explodingappendix.com. That's about all that I've got to say for now, so over to Barbara. So the opening chapter of George Grosz and the Communist Party, which is your 1997 book, you explore how the writings of the radical psychoanalyst Otto Grosz, his imprisonment as a mentally ill anarchist, and George Grosz's own experiences of the First World War led to a questioning of the notions of madness and sanity. How did this questioning of madness and sanity shape early Dadaist work, especially George Grosz's work in particular?
Well, I think the specific context is, of course, extremely important, and that is, I think it's hard for us to fully grasp how completely rigid German culture was, morally, in all sorts of ways. So you've got a completely disciplined society, certainly in the school system and all that kind of stuff. You've got that. You've got the nascent fields of psychoanalytic theory growing as well. So the sort of landscape of the mind is becoming incredibly fascinating and interesting, but completely poorly understood, really all the way through this period. But it's kind of getting underway. And, Grosz wasn't the first one, certainly in his group, to be thinking about insanity as a kind of legitimate and even vitally important counter term or counter posture to this kind of, the claim to order that, he and his circle, held responsible basically for the outbreak of the war and the prosecution of the war. So it became, when I describe it, I talk about it transitioning from a kind of artistic posture into a politically radicalized stance. And that takes place over the course of the First World War. And of course, there's also the phenomenon that he's aware of and that his friends are actually experiencing, and he too, of being interned in mental asylums because of their resistance to the war. So it presented itself as an oppositional stance not even solely of the artist's own making. It was the dominant order kind of imposed that on them. So I think that his publisher, Wieland Herzfelde, had written an essay early on, I think it was 1914, called The Ethic of the Insane. And it's this idea that insanity is a necessary and positive counterterm to established society, and furthermore in the hands of people like Kandinsky, who even earlier was exploring the artwork of people who were in asylums and so forth as much more authentic modes of expression, that these were individuals who were unburdened by the kind of stultifying dominant order. So there was a kind of heroization of insanity that was very much a kind of, I would just say, sort of like a bohemian, artistic, aestheticized posture before the First World War, but it was the war that radicalized that. And so for the Dadaists, their whole aesthetic, the kind of spontaneity of their aesthetic was something that they equated with the unfettered aesthetic and intellectual and emotional makeup of the insane as a viable sort of critique and radical posture to assume. So it goes together. But I think the critical thing is the political radicalization of that during the war. And it became
one of the things that I thought was really interesting about your book is in part that kind of way that making out that you're insane or pretending to be insane was a way of getting out of the front line of the war.
Yeah, I mean, there's some, like Franz Jung was, sort of rumored to have deliberately acted insane, and even Grosz was, but nobody really knows, and what did insane mean? It meant, that you were physically destroyed by the possibility of being sent to the front, but there were artists like Kirchner and others of that generation who really did suffer mental breakdowns. So it's, it's kind of I have to say that in some circles, Grosz was considered to be, sort of I don't know, that he was just playing the game and stuff like that. Well, I don't know that. Who's going to know that? So I accept it for what it was described as, and that was a kind of mental break that he had. So
it's interesting. I suppose the other thing is, Otto Grosz it became quite political in relation to a lot of satirists' work. Yeah,
no, I think he liked the connection between their names too. So that was nice.
Yeah.
But the same thing. I mean, in Foucault, I sort of relied on Foucault a little bit just for conceptualizing it. That anything that doesn't fit into the dominant order is often dismissed as being, aberrant or insane or what have you, and so they assumed that as a legitimate posture of resistance in various ways.
I was just reading that book by R.D. Laing, Insanity in the Family. It's the same sort of thing. It's sort of, again, it's that thing of madness and not fitting in, but this is on a sort of familial level. So I was taking it back to people like Althusser and those sort of people. That's along those lines of Foucault, but just, from a slightly, from R.D. Laing's point of view.
I haven't read Laing, but I'm aware of that book. And certainly the concept is one that has broad reach, let's put it that way.
I suppose Otto Grosz is one of those sort of, he's like a forerunner of Laing. Would that be a fair way to describe him?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm a little fuzzy. I read quite a lot on him, but it was his personal life, his sexuality, all of these things were at issue. And his basic unwillingness to sort of adhere to, again, these incredible, Victorianism had nothing on Germany in terms of just the rigidity of mores, so it wasn't too hard to transgress, and Otto Grosz took it on with great gusto, I think on a personal level, you could look at him and say, this is where the personal becomes very political, because he really integrated that into his sexuality, the whole spectrum.
It's interesting that so much comes out of Germany at that period, and it's also quite a repressive time in a way. There's a load of things that I'm often drawn, whether it's just like, might be the theory of relativity, or it might be like phenomenology, or it might be psychoanalysis, or it's Dada, or the sort of Spartacism, or all these other things. It's just, they're all sort of happening there. I don't know, it's just interesting that that's all coming out of a culture that's also seems quite repressive.
That seems to be I keep seeing that theme over and over and over. In fact, I distill it down to what is the first story in the Bible. Don't eat that. What? You end up, it's like, don't eat the apple, I'm going to eat the apple. It's like human nature. And I was years ago, I was reading a website back when the web was just starting, on the history of pornography and what a battle it was. And the more repression, the crazier things got. And then the Kinsey movie came out, because I said earlier, I love popular media, just getting ideas going. And then you end up reading and digging into them. And then from there, it was just like, the more repressive a society, it turns out we're pretty damn crazy when we're repressed. And then when it's all out there, we have to find something else to rebel against. That's my take on what I keep seeing as a pattern throughout history.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. I mean, you could see that also in sort of kind of Soviet Union and kind of especially under Stalin, and same like a massive burst of creativity, but in response to that repression. And it makes me think of whether or not, I suppose what I'm trying to say is, without something to transgress, it becomes very difficult to create anything that seems genuinely radical. And it's not this sort of fetishizing living under a fascist or, you know, an authoritarian communist society, but it does make you wonder. You know, I struggle to think of a recent major kind of radical artistic movement, because it's very difficult to transgress anymore. You know what I mean?
I suppose there's the possibility of a kind of radicalism that doesn't involve transgression. So you can have the sort of moments where you're actually trying to build different ways of being with each other. So I suppose that would be.
But that's not as much fun. we have to go break the rules. It's like in our system. An argument I saw for what's going on like right now in the United States, where you have just sort of these two big groups, that it's always been distilled down to this or that, which the world is not like that. Humans want to get away with something. If you put them in charge of something, we're going to be assholes. And one of the writers for my blog hit upon that. It's like, we have to have rules. And then you get Germany that takes the rules in this whole other direction, where it's like, no, we're really structured here now. And I just keep watching all this, and I always look for what is someone going to get away with. And that's where the really cool stuff is, and you got to tap that somehow. The Dilbert comic strip in the 1990s was just based on a horrible job the guy had. And it resonated with so many people who were working in cubes and hated that environment. We're all we're rebelling against stuff. I think we have causes again today. So
it's almost as like as well with those very rigid societies in which you know, it's a socially cohesive kind of model. I mean, that's the one thing you can say of it, which is neither a positive nor a negative thing. It's just an observation. It's like the act of the individual kind of lashing out and refusing to sort of go along with that is something that's radical. But nowadays, because of like, you know, hyper individualism and neoliberalism and this sort of thing, it's almost like the more radical thing is to not be that individual. It's to build collectives and build groups and build movements out of, you know, commonality and coming together. It's sort of the opposite way around, really.
I agree. I mean, I think, you know, again, you know, looking at thinkers in the 1920s, the whole bunch of Western Marxists, you know, realized that capitalism was very adept at absorbing critique, you know, and now it's like the individual gesture that's not what seems very radical anymore. It is the threat of collectivism, you know, and it's really, and so we are seeing like the death rattle of a culture right before our eyes that absolutely needs to move in that direction and is terrified of doing it. I mean, that's the scary thing. Part of what's difficult for me in dealing with the contemporary scene is that it's so atomized. I don't know what anybody is doing. I mean, you know, I see really interesting artistic interventions and critical. I don't even know how to assess it anymore, because we have such a mediascape, you know, that it's very difficult to make a blanket judgment that there isn't really serious radical stuff going on that I just don't know. But I do believe that the radical gesture now is the collective one. I just think it is. It may be the only thing that saves us, frankly.
I think both sides of what we're seeing right now, and I see there's a lot of nuance, but you really have to dig for it. are both playing the collective game. It's like, I'm right, I'm part of this group. I'm right, I'm part of this group. And
But they're both neoliberal to the core. Yeah, if you're talking about our major parties, they are neoliberal.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. Whether or not they realize it.
So both sort of Rosa Luxemburg and the Spartacus League in Germany and Alexander Bogdanov and the Prolocult movement in Russia favoured the idea that the liberation of the workers was a matter for the workers themselves. So in contrast with Lenin's emphasis on the party as vanguard, they're focusing on the workers. How did these ideas shape the Berlin Dadaists' entry into politics?
Well, I have your questions here. I printed them out, and I think this is the most difficult and in some ways the most interesting one to me, because it seems to me that it's a persistent problem, and it's one that Grosz and his circle addressed head on when they were kind of transitioning from the Dada movement to a kind of proletarian revolutionary art movement. But it's a question of, where does the artist stand in revolution? Some of their early struggles with the party were precisely along those lines, and the idea of, okay, so I'm a trained artist, I live in a capitalist country, I've had the privileges of that system, and I want to help forward revolution, and there's one faction that's telling me that I have to subordinate my artistic presence and my capabilities and so forth to the workers in this case. So it's the whole prolet cult movement. And, on the other hand, I'm being dismissed as being part of a bourgeois, art scene that is politically bankrupt. And they tried to deal with that and ran into trouble in lots of different ways. So, Wieland Herzfeld, who's Grosz's publisher and really kind of the political, I would say, if there was a political mastermind in that group, it was him. And, and he wrote about this, what is the role of the artist in revolution? His position was that the artist had certain skills and talents that could serve the critical interests of the revolution. For them to subordinate it would actually blunt its critical possibilities. And actually Trotsky says something rather similar later when he really objects to tendencies within the party to want to establish a proletarian culture. That's like freezing in ice something that should be transitional. And it's also completely undermining what art has to offer that has come to fruition in the capitalist West, namely modernist culture. And that's its critical potential, to be constantly questioning and constantly pushing the boundaries of what one conceptualizes as art, what conceptualizes its role in a political struggle, all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, that if I was like to boil it down, I think it was kind of a clash between a kind of modernist conception of the artist as critically autonomous versus a party perception that the artist should be subordinated to, the order of the day, which was creating a proletarian culture. So Herzfeld tried to argue that through and said, we've got a real role to play here. And, it doesn't help things essentially. And I think this resonates today. It doesn't help things essentially to completely negate expertise and the training that these people had. And they were so media savvy. I mean, that's one thing about Dada. They understood media absolutely, and it's like, do we want to throw that away? When part of the terrain that has to be conquered here is exactly that media culture. And no prolet cult is going to do that, because it just is coming out of a different place. So I think I think it continues to be a thorny issue. What is the role of that kind of expertise, and that, wherever it comes from? In Grosz's case, it came from he was, like I say, working class, but he had the privilege of going to an academy and trained, and he worked his tail off, and he became, a very prolific artist. But was he supposed to just, sit back and subordinate his work to that of the prolet cult? There may be a time and a place for everything, but this was the debate.
Yeah, I guess that there's, because I think what happens is it ends up becoming a kind of very much party-based idea of what a proletarian culture would be. The party has a certain authority. Whereas it seems like someone like Bogdanov has much more of an idea of, the workers themselves producing art, which I think you talk about in relation to sort of Piscator's notion of theatre.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of, so there's this participatory element going on.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that idea of like a prolocult, which I think fits into Dada. There's a kind of an element in which Dada seems very much, there's a participatory element to Dada. Whereas it looks like what the party's trying to do and how they're trying to manage proletarian culture is almost top down.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Dada's slogan basically was anybody can do it, you know, and, if you have a pair of scissors and some glue, you can be a Dadaist. This was one of the things that was written into the pamphlet for the first International Dada Fair. There was only one untrained artist who took part in that. So, it was a little bit of fudging what the reality was, but certainly it opened itself up to the possibility that anybody could do it. But in that particular context, it was, again, that was part of the political gesture, was to dismantle the kind of elitist institutionalized notion of what constituted art. That was their real objective. It wasn't so much going and working with workers to do it. I mean, Hartfield goes to the Soviet Union to work with Soviet soldiers to learn how to do montage. And there are, like, Billy Munzenberg and others have journals in the 20s where they're actually soliciting drawings and stuff from workers and and giving them cameras to go out and do it. But I'm telling you, the circulation of those images and stuff is pretty limited. I mean, it really is. There's a role for a really good artist, to get their stuff out there and to have it picked up in a media environment in the way that these artists were really self-conscious about trying to do.
Saying about the media savvy aspect of it, well, you need an artist to do that, like a media savvy artist, because you have people like the Nazi Party, and they were very good at manipulating the media, and it's sometimes it was underestimated, and that was the problem. Maybe they were so successful, and I think in a way the left still suffers from that. Even now in our country, in the UK, I think they don't seem to be. I'm not sure whether the Tory party is either, actually, but I don't know. I don't think the left are sort of, they have the kind of aesthetic, oldie worldy aesthetic, It's not very Dada, it's not very artistic, there's nothing of that in it,
One of the most interesting letters that I came across when I was doing research all those years ago was a letter that Wieland Hersfelde wrote to John Hartfield, and he said, "Oh my God, the Nazis have picked up on montage. They're actually copying us." And it's like, oh my God, what does this mean? So it really, they did see that as sort of the battleground. It was like, how do you, and of course by then they had to leave, they had to flee the country. And so, but it was like, yeah, this is really serious. This is a serious arena of political struggle, actually.
Well, when you think about it as a movement, I mean, although they're Nazis, they with Leni Riefenstahl style of her films and everything, there's a lot of those kind of images and sort of aesthetic, look and shape and whatever, that was quite well thought out, I suppose. And
she won a gold medal at Cannes, didn't she? I think for Olympia. So, it's a big issue.
Also, I'm not sure what a proletarian culture is. It's like some middle class people saying what they think that is. Maybe I'm not sure.
Well, I think that may be that is, yes. I mean, there is a kind of proletarian romanticism that it's somehow this untainted, singularity out there that, of course, is not true. So, I mean, that's another whole other problem.
I'll give a take about just sort of bringing in random artists, because I did try that, and I've been involved in things that do that. Like there was a local art group that decided we're going to put on a show and invite anyone, and what happens is you get a lot of bad work. You get a lot of work that they think is good. I remember that particular show had at one point this really bizarre looking teddy bear that looked very Dadaist that was painted by a 14-year-old. And I remember I was one of the judges, and I'm standing there with another judge, and we're going, that thing has to win. It's so brilliant. And they're like, the artist didn't know what they were doing. I said, yeah, that's why it's so brilliant. And we ended up losing the argument. I usually teach students right out of high school. Mm-hmm. And they're like, I teach a Bauhaus seminar. When you hit them with point, line, and plane, modernism, abstraction, I've literally had students go and try to have me fired for what I was teaching. I mean, it's this real big recreation of what you see going on with modern art. And in fact, I blogged about it once. It's very long. flom.us, FLOMM.us/bow. I did this about 5 years ago, and I blogged the class live in segments, which was, I'll never do it again. It was too hard to keep track of everything. And in the middle of it, I had a student who decided I should be fired for what I'm teaching, and he took it up to the college president. And I remember my department chair was just like, "You've got to be kidding." And I was like, "What are you teaching?" "I'm teaching modern art." And we have another person in our group who actually puts on little art fairs. You can learn to do art and you drink wine and stuff. And she's personalized it. And I asked her about modern art. She's like, "I tried it with a corporation and they all fought me." And it's still radical today.
I was going to say, if it's sort of IKEA designs, though, it's okay if it's in design. Yeah, there's a bit of modernism there. People have it in their homes if it's that, but
they don't know what to do with it, do they? Or they look at the catalog, or they go postmodern and say, "Well, we have to decorate it."
Yeah, I think people like it in that way more. It seems to be in a lot of people's homes, but.
So I just wanted to pick up on something you said earlier, Barbara, about the Dadaists realizing the Nazi parties have cottoned on to montage as a technique. It reminded me of what Benjamin said about the responding to the aestheticization of politics with the politicization of aesthetics. But it seems like that's exactly what he's talking about. But now when I think of a political aesthetic, at least in the UK, I mean, maybe it's a little bit different in the US, but it just seems like red team, blue team, suits, very little sort of radical aesthetic difference between divergent political lines, and that seems to really strike me as a big difference when you kind of consider the aesthetic radical aesthetic difference in different movements back then. I wonder if that's kind of another kind of symptom of this homogeneity of current political ideology and stuff.
I mean, are you suggesting the kind of, you could say, dualism between the radicalism of the Nazis and the communists? Yeah.
I think there was some sort of kind of radical difference, especially if you kind of think of this whole, we are the party of the workers, we're often like kind of portrayed in overalls with, tools and this kind of thing against this sort of like leather-clad Nazi SS symbolism and skulls and who was this fashion designer who made their uniforms? I forget now.
Yeah, I forget too. Yeah.
Hugo.
I had an argument with a Trump supporter online. They're just throwing out little random catchphrases here and there. And sometimes I just like to debate with them just for fun because I can practice humor. And one of them was just like, Hitler was a Nazi. And Hitler was a communist. And I was like, whoa, dude, you're way off. And the person had taken socialism and Nazi, but what I realized he was arguing was Nazi looked like communism. It must have been the same thing. And I couldn't win the argument.
I don't know if it does, though. That's the thing, though.
Yeah.
This thing of like the workers dressing up in overalls, well, I mean, is that like sort of like...
Sorry, I mean the party members, like politicians and stuff, seeing sort of... Yeah. Lenin in overalls or whatever.
Yeah, that sounds. Where was that? It sounds a little bit. Maybe is that patronising the workers? Because workers, do they want to dress in overalls? Do they see themselves as defined by their overall? I don't know. Or do they like fashion? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but there does seem to be some sort of radical difference in what the. Well, obviously there's a radical ideological difference, but it's this idea of the aestheticization of politics that I think it's easy to overlook the fact that politicians even now are carefully choosing their image and how they display themselves to the public and to potential voters, and yet it's very hard for me now to see any sort of aesthetic difference between kind of anyone presenting anything, politically in the UK, at least.
There's no embracing of art as in those days. At least they've thought of it. There's nothing like that really. So it's just all very plain, as you say, in suits.
When I think about then and now, I think that both the Nazi Party and the Communist Party had one thing right, and that is that they really needed to address the workers. And that is something we have not done. And that's why we are where we are. But, it's really, again, I'm thinking back to research that I did and a letter that didn't make it into, I don't think I published anything about this, but it was an interesting kind of discussion between two artists on the left. They were both Communist Party members in the late 20s. And they had kind of come to the realization that avant-garde art, as well as the kind of sort of proletarian revolutionary art that they were producing at that time, neither of these were cutting it with the workers. And one of them concluded that what the workers really wanted were woodcuts that were similar to the kinds of things that they were hanging in their homes. They didn't identify with the very things that were being proffered to them as their culture and what they should want. And they didn't recognize, it was like they might see stuff in an illustrated journal or something, and it was like they weren't taking it and tacking it up on their walls. If I'm looking at now and then, I think this is the persistent problem for any kind of progressive project, and that is, how do you speak to the working class? How do you address their concerns? How do you do that in a language that they recognize as being addressed to them? And clearly we have failed miserably, because the only word, at least in this country, that's getting through is the bullshit that Trump says that he's doing and he's not doing. So I think that, looking at what happened in the late 20s in Germany with the kind of, Janus face of the National Socialists and the Communists, they were both missing the mark, in some ways. I mean, the Nazis obviously did a better job in the end, but, getting through the workers about a progressive position was obviously not something that the Communist Party or the Social Democrats were able to do.
I mean, within the Communist Party, so assumably, we seem to have, there's like a divide between the sort of more Leninist wing of the Communist Party and then the sort of more Spartacist wing. It's the second one that seems much more pro sort of democratic ideas and those that sort of emphasis, sort of more libertarian communist or council communist position. And from your book, it sort of really places the Dadaists in the second camp, whereas the party itself does sound much more like a Leninist. Yeah. And where the idea of what the working class is being kind of dictated by the party. You might have hoped for, which maybe has something more like a solution, is in this other wing where it seems to actually much more, in Bogdanov and in sort of Rosa Luxemburg, it seems like the workers have some sort of role in developing their culture. So it's not...
Yeah, there's certainly more of a gesture to that, that's for sure. No, that is a major distinction. Yeah, I agree.
You would say, though, that, I mean, that just to go back to that, that the Nazis, in a way, that they did have quite a modernist aesthetic, would you say, apart from all their sort of funny, phoenixes and stuff like that, their clothes are sort of square, Hugo Boss clothes, and maybe... And they stole the Dada imagery, the montage and all that. And maybe, and the swastika, is a sort of, constructivist image in a way, that sort of thing. And so the modernist thing did do quite well. It did do well and sort of sold it to the proletariat. And I think there's quite a lot of times when sort of modernism, in magazines and sort of examples I could give you that have done really well and sold, It's like, I mean, in a way, it's like, you're taking the people who sort of are experts in the field of art and design and all that, and that's their job. The workers' job is their job, what they do, and maybe their job isn't actually to do the art and the design. You have to have the experts sort of who do that.
Well, there were a lot of Bauhaus designers who actually ended up producing work for the Nazis. So and the Nazi regime was very interested in presenting itself as a modern movement.
Yeah, I did think they hated the Bauhaus at one point and they sort of shut it down, but...
There's a contradiction that exists with that. The big eye-opener I saw was in a documentary on degenerate art, where it was like, okay, they confiscate all the art, they put in the show, now what happens to the art? And the Nazis ended up selling it. It was like they didn't destroy all of it, they sold it to make money. So they were very smart about it. Like growing up in the US, I remember you watch Hogan's Heroes and you think the Nazis were all idiots because of the propaganda in the US. And my dad was in World War II, and I remember him saying they were not as stupid as they're portrayed in films. My dad was in the Merchant Marine ducking German subs, and he used to transport prisoners of war, and he got to know them, especially if they spoke English. And he was just like, the U.S. has all of this wrong, and he was pretty angry about this stuff. He hated Hogan's Heroes. He thought it was funny, but he was like, they're not like that at all. No. So you see them saying, look, these images, they're horrible. The Fuhrer hates them, but let's put sans serif typeface on his poster. It'll read better. And there's a famous shot of a poster that says Hitler that you can read better because it's the opposite of German black letter.
Well, some of these guys actually just kept the art. So
yeah.
I mean, there's all sorts of
there's that too.
There are things being found here and there. Horkheimer and Adorno were absolutely right in their dialectic of enlightenment and I think this is what, at least for me, makes Germany continuously illuminating and relevant. Germany is the size of Texas. So in this little country, you have a concentration of forces that shows the best of modernity and the worst. And they add up to the same thing, in the kind of vision of totality that comes out of that. And so, anybody who says that the Germans were stupid is, confusing ethics with their intelligence. And even within that ethical parallel universe that they were inhabiting, it made sense to do what they were doing. I mean, if you have a kind of totalizing vision of the good life and the good society, then you want to get rid of all those things that you think are not gonna help. So it has an internal consistency.
It's a bit like stealing modernism from that were mainly, I suppose, sort of socialist artists, really, like that, and making sure you get rid of all the socialist, connections with it, and importing it into sort of fascism, connecting it with mixes, and
Yeah. Take the stuff you want and get rid of the stuff that's annoying, But I think, actually one of the more important points about recognizing the modernism of the Nazi regime, and there was a scholar who made this point years ago, is that to do less than that is to, render the Nazi regime as some sort of anomaly in modernity. And in fact, it's not. It is part of it. Mentioned something about some of the motivations behind my second book that deals with Grosz in the United States. It was that painful recognition on the part of these artists that, and the person who's most eloquent on this is Thomas Mann. It's like, okay, the Germans are guilty, but this is part of modernity. Modernity itself is what's the problem here, in the way in which it's been conceptualized in its dream of totality, and that's what has to be criticized.
So George Grosz's role as a satirical cartoonist for the German Communist Party seems to be one in which he was torn between the party's competing visions of workers' emancipation and competing approaches to the role of satire. How did his role and the struggle around it shape his work of this period?
I guess I have two different answers to this. I mean, on the one hand, I actually think one of the most intelligent observers of satire during this period is Lou Merton, a woman who was a socialist writer and completely understudied, really fascinating, important woman. But she wrote an essay called, I think it was The Satirical Dialectic of Capitalism. And she had this kind of theory about how satire had originated as the voice of the people in slave narratives going back to antiquity. And that progressively, and again, you can kind of see, again, some of the thinking that becomes crystallized in Western Marxism, the way in which, with the development of different artistic media and a kind of capitalist art market, that the critical voice that she understood as being collective, necessarily collective, had been dispersed into these different media and had lost its kind of critical function. And, she weighed into the debates on Dada when the party said that, the Dadaists weren't doing effective political anything, satire or otherwise, that they were just messing around and doodling. She said that the problem for Dada is that under capitalism at that time, that satire was simply the mere reproduction of reality, that capital in and of itself was satire. And so that all that the Dadaists were doing was offering up a mirror to capital rather than a critique that would allow them to perceive what it was they were doing. And again, this has to do with the way in which, avant-garde formations are so quickly, immediately absorbed into the culture industry and their critical edge blunted. So she kind of reached the conclusion that satire under capitalism wasn't really possible. So this is one thing. In part, this feeds into another dimension of this problem, and that is that, satire became like a really sort of dominant mode in a lot of illustrated weeklies in Germany at that time. And so it did become very politically indiscriminate. The party tried to sort of rein it in and dictate what it was going to be, which then undercut its critical edge. I mean, satire is all about transgressing borders and that kind of stuff. So having a prescribed satire is it's almost a contradiction in terms. It's not impossible, but it's tough. And so, Grosz, as many people did, found plenty of things to criticize about the party. But he wasn't allowed to, so it was like, okay, you don't like my satire, you don't like my politics, we've got a problem here. And so he kind of insisted on a kind of critical independence, which they were actually willing to accommodate because he was so important as an artist. They wanted to keep him close as much as they could. So they didn't just, tell him to go take a hike. So there's that. And, if I'm trying to think of how that shaped his particular approach to satire. I think you and I and perhaps Steve were talking about this earlier, that Grosz continues to be looked on as, like one of the most lacerating, nastiest satirists in visual terms that ever was, Daumier is fantastic too, but Grosz is really seen as being nasty. People always ask me, was he a really nasty guy? I don't have any idea. I don't care, it doesn't matter to me. But what I know is that nobody looks at his work and thinks neutrally about it, which is quite an achievement in the situation. So I think that, maybe he was nasty. I have no idea, but he certainly continued to attempt to produce art that would provoke under whatever circumstances it was. As I write in the book, he gets into trouble with the party on a number of occasions for things. And certainly he was put on trial 3 times. So his stuff was working. It was working. Certainly as the party became Stalinized, that attempt to control became really repressive, actually. So in some ways it's surprising that he stayed as close to it as he did. But he did.
It is interesting that he kind of had that, for that period, that relationship with the Communist Party, trying to kind of negotiate some kind of line.
Yeah. He was like president of the Red Group in 1924. He tried all this stuff. And also some of his closest friends remained very stalwart party members. So there was that. There were personal connections that kept him close as well.
Could I ask you a question about one of the pictures shown? I'm very new to his body of work entirely. In fact, this is the first time. Yeah, it was the Republican automaton, because I wanted to ask if there's like a significance of this automaton figure for Grosz, because I feel like, and this is just the feeling I have when I see sort of robots or automatons or anything kind of mechanical that's being displayed, especially when it's a political subject or a subject that has some sort of ideology kind of attached to it, which we see, is definitely the case here. There's like sort of a judgment being made around freedom or ethical accountability, that perhaps there's this sort of radical determinism, they know not what they do sort of thing. But that seems to be run very contrary to, from what you've spoken about Grosz so far, like what he actually kind of feels regarding, his political views and this sort of thing in the world around him going on at that particular time. So yeah, I was just wondering about how much significance he's attaching to using the automaton as a figure in his work, or if I'm overthinking it massively.
Well, I don't know. It is a really interesting question. This is called Republican automaton. So it's meant as a satirical attack on the Social Democrats and other mainstream party right after World War I. So, their robotic, pre-programmed responses to what's going on is what is being assailed here. And I think in an image like this, too, the absence of human presence is also important, that this is a completely inhuman, faceless, simply numbers instead of names with pre-programmed slogans popping out of their heads. All of this under the guise of patriotism. So there's no mistake that one of them is holding the German flag.
He has a nice hat.
Yes, he does. And again, a kind of bourgeois bowler.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's specific in terms of, and he's got a veteran here, a war veteran wearing the Iron Cross and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But this is part of this whole sort of jingoistic, patriotic culture that is completely pre-programmed, inflexible, unable to recognize the continuing degradation of the working class and the presence of militarism and, you name it. So it's a different kind of satire, but it's very much in the same vein.
I love the modern building right behind the guy with the hat.
Mm-hmm.
As well, here's the new modern building coming in, but they're just going through. They're doing their thing.
It's not the only time he uses an automaton, right? He's using that at least in one of the other paintings, one of the drawings I've seen of his. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Down marries her pedantic automaton. Great title and kind of image that. But it seems to be a consistent theme in his work. And that seems to be, unless I'm missing the political subtext, that's something slightly less kind of politicized. Maybe there's like a personal fascination.
Well, I think that's certainly possible. The Dadaists in general were really, what's interesting about the Dadaists and technology in that regard, I think is an interesting, and I wrote a little bit about this, but it was really more conjecture than anything else. I see their fascination with technology, and if you look at like Hannah Huck's, cut with a Dada kitchen knife, where you've got all these, disassociated gears and all this kind of stuff, that is a kind of interesting Dadaist take on Soviet constructivism, which is very, it has a kind of structure and progressive ideology attached to it. I interpreted it in the past as a kind of critique of the nature of industry under a capitalist system. Whereas you would have a very productive kind of imagery coming out of the Soviet Union and a collectivist society, and under capitalism, technology was not necessarily emancipatory or to be understood that way. So I think a lot of that kind of stuff comes into these too, actually. And then they just kind of had fun with it too. I don't want to make it sound like Dada was all, real serious. It wasn't. And even in its lack of seriousness, it was deadly serious. So to make those distinctions is hard.
Yeah, it's coming from a few different angles. Yeah, so I can definitely see that. Yeah, and just sort of the way the body kind of during this period of time was sort of made more machine-like, just by the machines themselves, the factories themselves becoming. I suppose it was less about extensions of the human body as tools, and more about the human body bending itself and subjugating itself to the machines themselves, which were becoming more and more sort of totalizing, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that is really significant. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's almost like the liberating and alienating elements of the machine, its potential to be able to do both. And, going back to the futurists, there's this big tradition of the machine as something that has this potential.
But I don't want to make too much of it, because I think it was maybe just a sideline to this, but when they're doing this, they are very much in dialogue with Soviet constructivism, and they're making certain points about what is the nature of revolution in Germany as opposed to the Soviet Union. And I don't know that point ever got registered properly, but it was, I think that they were really thinking that this kind of affirmative, productive notion of the technological intervention in everyday life under the conditions of capitalism is inappropriate. That's just not what the situation is. So I think that was part of what was going on.
So in 1928, George Grosz collaborated with the theatre director Owen Piscator, helping to create the set for The Adventures of the Good Soldier Schweik. The illustrations would land Grosz in court numerous times on charges of blasphemy. How did these events shape Grosz's understanding of the escalating situation in Germany, and further his commitment to artistic freedom of expression?
Well, there are several things going on. He was on trial for 3 years, actually, for that series. The images were used as stage backdrops, and then they were put in a portfolio and circulated, and that's when everything blew apart. And, the sort of anti-clerical aspects of those images has everything to do with the church's support for militarism at this time. And so it was a pointed attack on the church as a kind of handmaiden to resurgent militarism in Germany. He was facing going to jail. His life was totally upended. He also became an international celebrity as a result of it, which had everything to do with his being solicited to come to the United States. Okay, so the question of artistic freedom, the political landscape was so extremely polarized. This is one factor. It's like there isn't a lot of wiggle room for saying anything on one side or the other. But then there's also the world economic crisis. So it's like the market is drying up at this very time too, and he's got a family. So he's really worried about putting bread on the table, basically. So those are the factors that contribute to him leaving. I mean, it did become it was the case that was going on at the time, and witnesses after witnesses after witnesses. You talk about this, we use the word today, weaponizing of religion and all this kind of stuff, and it was definitely being weaponized. Censorship was definitely being used as a tool to repress expression in Germany, especially even from the early 20s on. Grosz was on trial 3 times. One was for insulting the military, coming out of Dada. The other was insulting morals in 1924. And then this one for blasphemy. I mean, the courts were heavily right-wing, heavily. I mean, that was one of the legacies of World War I, was that the judiciary that was in place during the war basically stayed in place. So you had all these right-wingers who were kind of calling the shots. And so there were lots of cases that were brought against artists, and lots of books banned and stuff like that. And that was the case here. Now, I think, this is where Grosz's publisher becomes an interesting player, because I think he was very interested in challenging these kinds of restrictions. So he would circulate things just to push the limit, which of course proved the political efficacy of the work that was being done, but it imperiled Grosz's life and livelihood.
Yeah.
So I think it was a little bit of a difficult time, let's put it that way. And so he left, and he was lucky to do so at the time that he did.
Yeah.
And I think that he looked on coming to the United States as the place where he could be free to do what he wanted. I think he found other factors that came into play in the United States that didn't allow for that either. There were certain expectations of him, that people wanted him either to be the political artist of the 20s, and he wasn't in agreement anymore with the party, so he wasn't going to do that. Or he wanted to be the great American artist, and people said, well, now wait a minute, you're this crazy German. We want to understand Germany through your art. So it better have something to say about that. So the market is its own tether. It restricts freedom too, and he needs money.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, because he seems to sort of almost embrace that role of the sellout at points.
I think he does it to really piss his friends off.
Yeah.
I think he was really good at that. He played that one up quite a lot.
There's the personality coming out.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. A letter after letter, reading about what are we going to do about him? What are we going to do? So clearly they did succeed. So
you invited a troublemaker into your midst, and you expected something else?
I'll just give you one little anecdote. I mean, there are many anecdotes about him, but there's this wonderful letter that a friend of his, Kurt Tucholsky, who was a satirical author in the 20s, wrote this letter to a friend, and he says, I absolutely hate walking in the forest with Grosz because he never shuts the fuck up. So, it's just like, he just keeps going. So he was tough, I'm sure.
So there's a commitment, I think, to free expression on the one hand, but there's also this need to survive. I think that produces an antagonism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you gotta make money off of this stuff.
Yeah.
And as much as, this is what a lot of these artists face. It's like, well, we really want to make our work count with the working class, but the working class can't afford us, so it's kind of a problem.
So George Grosz emigrated to America. He sort of shifts his focus to some extent. So in the final chapter of George Grosz and the Communist Party, you explore his later work in relation to Diego Rivera and the sort of anti-communist left. So in contrast to this, George Grosz's later work is often charged with sort of misanthropy and sort of the rejection of hope altogether. So I'm sort of wondering to what extent Grosz's later work can be seen as part of a kind of anti-Stalinist left, and to what extent could it be said to reject left politics or politics generally altogether?
I mean, certainly some of those images are actually in reference to books that are written by Max Eastman and others that are, really, I mean, you're looking at a point in time when there's the generation of what's often referred to as the totalitarian thesis, and that is that, Nazism and communism are exactly the same thing. And then counterposed with that, of course, are all the virtues of democratic liberalism in the United States. So I think in that way that he is very much of his generation in seeing things that way. I think, again, this is where his personal connections come in and where his stature comes in because, of course, he was really a towering figure in the artistic left. So when he came to the United States, all these leftists wanted to know him and, be in connection with him. So he was kind of surrounded by them, and a number of them were becoming extremely critical of Stalinism. So, he agreed, I think, with them. But I think he was so fed up with the polarizations and so forth that I think if one had the opportunity to ask him, he would say, I am renouncing politics altogether. But of course, his work continues to be political. It's just like a compulsion. This is the world that he knows, and the thing that stimulates him artistically, intellectually, and so on. He never retreats into art for art's sake. Let's put it that way. But he's just so, and you see it in those images. I mean, they're really bitter about, it's just like, oh God, there's nothing here. So like in that image of the Nazi and the communist sitting on the chairs with art swinging in between, they too have the tops of their heads lopped off. So again, it's this kind of this sense of the robotic, that they have simply become robotic. There's no critical consciousness here. There's no way out of this. And you've got art just there. It should be noted too that figure of art looks very effeminate. It's got these little frilly pants on, and that was also, that's a really nasty image in Grosz's Weltanschauung, his worldview, that art has become completely ineffectual. It can do nothing between these two colossus figures. So he uses gender, the gendering of his imagery is important. It's pretty much on record. He was a pretty big misogynist, to be honest. So, to use that kind of gendering is part of his cynicism that is coming through there. He's paying attention to what the anti-Stalinist left is talking about. That's his world. Those are the people he knows and who know him and keep trying to draw him in. But he's really pretty embittered about the whole thing. And he's embittered that they keep trying to drag him into it. So, but then what would he do? So, it's a kind of contradictory thing.
Was it also, his fight seemed bigger by the time he came to the US? It was like he went all through this in the 20s, in the 30s, ended up in the US, and then they're like, no, we must fight Stalin now. It's just like, I'm sick of all of you. At least that's what I start getting from his later work. It could be the whole age thing too. I'm older, you guys are younger. I heard one theory that he just was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to paint happy pictures. And it's like your favorite band puts out a new album that just doesn't work like the old album.
Well, I guess I actually developed a great deal of empathy for him after he came to the States, because I actually think that he entered into a period of really intense self-reflection. And so, you even see that in his artistic practice. So he actually goes back to the kind of draftsmanship and the work that he was doing at the Dresden Academy as a young man, right? And I think that he's thinking through, and again, it feeds into the larger narrative of German guilt, that he's really thinking about this culture that he's come from. He's being held up as a representative of it, whether he wants to be or not. And very often he doesn't want to be, but he's constantly being asked to comment, and to think about it. So it's like he can't escape it. No matter how far he gets away from it, he can't escape it. And I think he becomes really self-reflective, and no doubt also brought to self-reflection about how the activities of the Communist Party and its infighting with the Social Democrats, condemning them as social fascists, was implicated in Hitler's rise to power. You know, there's a lot to be critical there about what one did. You know, this was what he did. This was the stuff that he was involved with. And it's like, okay, how guilty am I? You know, how painful would that be to actually think about your complicity in a culture that put up death camps and stuff, you know? So, I mean, I think that he started drinking he was always a heavy drinker, but he started really drinking. And it actually becomes painfully evident in the 40s and 50s where, you know, his stuff really suffers. Not the stuff that gets published and stuff, but, you know, the private letters and the private drawings and stuff, they're just like a mess. I think he was being very introspective and kind of suffering. You know, I just see it that way.
I can relate to that. My dad was older. He was in World War II. He didn't talk about it for the longest time. Yeah, drinking came in, 50s, 60s. Eventually that went away and I got to know him. In the 80s, I remember my uncle started showing some movies of his little trip to Korea, which was not a war zone. And my dad just flipped out and started talking about his war experiences, and he was in combat. He was in all this stuff. He was trying to get the words together about what he experienced. And I remember just going to see Saving Private Ryan with him. And he, at the opening scene, you could feel the stress in the theater. And he was just sitting there calmly drinking a coffee. And finally, when the opening scenes were over, he looked at me and said, "That's pretty much it. They finally got it right." But there was also this big guilt about everyone who died around him. Could he have made different decisions? And just living through all that. So you're thinking George Grosz, World War I, what happened with the Nazi Party in history. That's a lot to really process, especially at a time where even my dad never believed in therapy. It was just sort of like, you have to deal with it.
The person who is, again, most articulate on this question is Thomas Mann, because he talks about German guilt. If you want to make yourself cry, read some of his stuff that he writes about, you know, his just profound sense of guilt and responsibility for what has happened. You know, this is this great culture that he was an exemplar of, and look what it's done. I don't know how you shoulder that, actually, writing about it.
So in your book, The Exile of George Grosz, which is a book from 2015, you return to the art of George Grosz and turn to his later work. In that book, you approach his American work in relation to other World War II exiles such as Bertolt Brecht and Thomas Mann, as well as discussions around the hopes of world peace and a one world order. Why was this an important vantage point to reassessing Grosz's later work?
The context in which I was writing after 9/11 and all that, and all of the kind of Islamophobia and stuff that was going on, I was very interested in writings coming out of cosmopolitanism and trying to think through these divisions that were being ever more deeply insisted upon, even after the fall of the Berlin Wall and all that kind of stuff, that there was new walls were being thrown up and all this kind of stuff. So that was the sort of larger framework for my thinking about it. And I'm very interested in, the possibilities that the historical past sort of offers up that we don't follow, what the potentials are there. And so actually right now I'm reading this huge, this is not bedtime reading, this Capital and Ideology by Piketty. It takes a long time, but that's partly his premise in this book too. Since the Reagan-Thatcher era, capital has been unfettered. It doesn't have this countervailing force of the Soviet Union, no matter how screwed up that was, but it was a break on unfettered neoliberal capitalism and stuff. Piketty's book is about going back and tracing the history of capital and ideology, and highlighting what were alternatives that were available when. So that kind of thinking was really kind of striking to me, because I had been asked to speak on Grosz, during this period, and I just again started reading Thomas Mann and all this, and their discussions about a one world order kept coming up. And actually, I mean, as artists, you know this, like you get inspired by the weirdest things sometimes. You don't even know where it's coming from. But I remember I was listening to the radio one day, And it was about these kind of neo-Nazi militias that sort of Pennsylvania has quite a number of militia groups. The Grand Dragon used to live near here, and all that kind of stuff. So we've got our share of those sorts of groups. And there was this radio report about how these individuals were convinced that the government was set on taking over everything and the world, right? So this notion of a one world order was one that they were operating with, and that's why they had to kind of hang out in their little groups out in the hills and arm themselves to the teeth so that they would be ready, for this moment of takeover. And the expose was about their reading material. And apparently it was like all these books and pamphlets from the 40s and 50s that were talking about a one world order, which is exactly the generation that these people are. And so it was like, oh my God, I hadn't even heard about that, and so I began researching that, and of course there was discussion of that, and not necessarily for bad purposes. After World War II, that some sort of a UN would have to effectively be put in place in order to stop a conflict like that from ever emerging again. And Thomas Mann and others became involved in this kind of thinking. Grosz was hired to illustrate a satirical volume about the idea called One World, not One World. And so like all this stuff started to come together, and it was like, oh, this is really interesting. And what pained me in reading about it was that, there were some really good, thoughtful roads we could have taken after World War II, and we didn't, so, the Cold War set in immediately, and then that was the end of that. It was just off the table. But there was some really serious, interesting stuff that was going on. And so that's why I was kind of interested in that whole angle. And also, in terms of art history, certainly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's very much in line with a rethinking of this kind of Cold War thesis about the distinctions between modernism and realism or socialist realism, that this is a completely contrived, division of the world up into different aesthetic categories that don't really work. But they did have some reality to them because Grosz, of course, was struggling with establishing his career. He was never he thought abstraction was kind of stupid. So he never went that way, but it cost him in terms of his ability to compete with the kind of market status of abstract expressionism. So in terms of thinking critically about my field, this was a kind of intervention against those sorts of dichotomies that had relegated his American work to the dustbin, that it wasn't really worthy of being considered. I find myself coming back to him over and over again because for whatever reasons, he's got his finger sort of on the pulse of things, whether he wants to have it or not. And so it's really interesting to be able to ask really big critical questions of his work, because it kind of gives you this lens onto these larger kinds of issues. So it was a conglomeration of things, but it really took me in a very different direction than the first book.
It is definitely a different direction. The second book, I think it's really interesting because there's ambivalences in that. They keep you really thinking,
It's a more, I think probably the reason that I wasn't interested, first of all, but I think it took me a while to wrap my head around those ambivalences. They weren't so pronounced in the earlier work. And so it was harder for me to make sense of it in some way. So it took me longer to kind of deal with that. I don't mean to make it sound like it's better or worse than the first book, but I think I had to deal with more nuance that I struggled with a lot, actually, in trying to write it. It's a more complicated story.
It is. But I think in some ways it's a really great book because of that, because you're actually really having to sort of grapple with where you stand in relation to all these different...
Yeah, no, thank you. It was hard.
So in your analysis of the 1945 piece, Cain or Hitler in Hell, you explore how this piece can be read as Grosz identifying with Hitler, exploring themes of guilt and responsibility for the Second World War. To what extent could this be said to break with his previous satirical critiques, favouring instead of a personal, introspective focus?
Obviously, his earlier depictions of Hitler, his satiric images are dramatically different. Again, this kind of pertains to this whole question of guilt and the kind of self-recognition with what has transpired in Germany. And it's interesting that you bring those images up, because that's what got me started. You know, I always start with an image. This is what provokes me, you know, into writing about something. And I was asked to do something on him, and there's actually a photograph of him sitting on a rooftop that is the basis for, and that was done in Berlin not too long before he left. And then he does that self-portrait, and then he adapts the composition for Cain. So there's a very strong connection between those three, and kind of unmistakable when you see them together. And it does sort of chart a trajectory of reflection. And again, Thomas Mann becomes useful because, and I think maybe Grosz actually read the essay and thought about it. Mann wrote an essay called "That Man Is My Brother." And it was like, you know, Hitler is my brother, you know, and I can't disavow this. This is part of, we come from the same culture. And this is also when Hitler is kind of, you know, heroizing the kind of culture that Thomas Mann heroized, you know, and it's like, oh my God, you know, I mean, we're doing the same things. So there was that level of self-recognition that was not just specific to Grosz, but it was part of the German exile community, really thinking about how are they positioned vis-a-vis what's going on. And so Grosz takes that photograph and the self-portrait and reinterprets it as the figure of Hitler. And, you know, and of course the image is, its original title is Cain. So, you know, it's an image of fratricide, you know, how Germans have basically kind of killed themselves, or they're, you know, done it to themselves. But I think what was also, again, talking about, you know, a kind of intellectual creative process, I noted that there were serious distinctions between the drawing that you showed of Cain and the painting. And in the book, I talk about how Grosz adapted for the sort of landscape this photograph from World War II of dead US soldiers on the beach. Again, that was just one of these kind of weird moments. I had the Life magazine reproduction lying on my desktop, and I was looking at the two Cain images, and I saw the correspondence with that landscape in the painting. And I thought, and Grosz, you know, was very overt about a working process where he would take something that he had seen and then it would reemerge in a totally different guise somewhere else, you know, and I thought, oh my God, you know, this, and there's a whole story about that photograph and why it would be important for him to use it. But it was really kind of addressing very contemporary discussions about, you know, German guilt that are, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about what to do about Germany. You know, it's like, okay, we're going to level it. That was one idea, you know, return it to being farms, and that's it. You know, take all of their industry away and just, you know, that's it. And all sorts of things. So there's lots of discussion about that. And he's, you know, I think what's striking is that it becomes a very painful personal reflection on himself. I mean, he's putting himself in the guise of Hitler. So I was pleased, although nobody has said anything about this. This painting was kind of languishing relatively in obscurity. I mean, it was shown and stuff, but not much attention to it. Now it's in the German Historical Museum. It's been purchased. So there you go. I mean, I may have actually made this painting of interest to the German Historical Institute, but it's, you know, but I think that that's an interesting aspect of the afterlife of that painting is that, you know, what it's talking about is not being recognized, was not being recognized, and now it is. I think that that there were a lot of reasons after World War II why that subtext simply could not be accessed.
One of the things that you constantly raise, I think, in that book is that there's a lot of things that Grosz was dealing with that people just didn't want to deal with at that time. It goes quite deep. It does. It's a level of self-reflection that I think it was either too painful or people just would not recognize it at all. So it really just got kind of written out. So that made that a really fascinating exploration for me. I think it's a really extraordinary, I can't imagine what he went through to do that. That must have been quite a process. Yeah, I mean, it's so much more personal at that point. You know, his earlier caricatures of Hitler, it wasn't him.
It was something else, you know.
Yeah.
So it's very different.
So in your discussion of the pieces such as Painter of the Whole, 1948, Attacked by the Stickmen, 1947, and The Grey Man Dances, you explore how Grosz's later work shares a preoccupation with the existentialism of Sartre and Heidegger and the critique of sort of totalitarianism offered by Orwell, Arendt, Adorno and Horkheimer. To what extent do these pieces mark a distinct shift in the intellectual development of Grosz's work?
I mean, to the extent that he's actually reading existentialism, I think that's a little bit of an open question, but he's, you know, there was a kind of popularization of existentialism. And I think Grosz was much more in touch with the popular rather than the theoretical implications of what Sartre and others were writing. You know, so it's kind of this philosophy of doom, you know, really negative. And so, you know, I think he was very taken with that idea. And, you know, I think these are by far, if we have to put his works on a sliding spectrum of, you know, optimism to negativism, I think these are the most negative by far. Just drawing some of the worst conclusions out of existentialist thought, which actually, you know, in the hands of Sartre and others is quite liberatory. But for Grosz, it was extremely negative. Like The Painter of the Whole, I mean, this is where his personal despair is. Again, he's drinking quite heavily during this period, but he's also having trouble selling, certainly at the rate that he was used to doing so. So The Painter of the Whole is as much an assault on abstraction as it is on anything else. You know, he has nothing but contempt for it and sees it as a pointless endeavor. And this is, you know, the emphasis on the pointless is what he derives from his reading of existentialism. It's a different stage for him, or let's put it this way. The thing that, again, I think makes him an extremely interesting artist is that he was a big reader. I mean, he read a lot. And so I think it's very interesting to see how the kind of literary and to a certain extent theoretical discourses that are circulating around him are ones that get integrated into his visual practice and how he's interpreting that. So he was right in there with, you know, reading about Sartre and Camus and all this kind of stuff. But this was the conclusion that he drew, this kind of negativity that was as much a reflection on his own struggles as an artist as much as anything else at that point. So it's very different than even the war period stuff. Yeah. I would say World War II. It's
almost as if he gets more introspective as he gets older.
I think he becomes angrier and more bitter. Yeah. Honestly, I think I would find it hard to rival the kind of introspection that could have led to a painting like Cain. I don't know how you can get deeper actually in thinking about the totality of what you have been and what your culture has been. And what it's all led to. I don't know. I would find that extremely painful. So I think he just becomes more bitter, actually. I don't know how deep he's looking. He's just kind of lashing out.
Yes, maybe, yeah.
So it's, and, you know, and like the revenge of the stickmen and all, you know, this is just like this frenetic lashing out. This is one way of looking at it, I think. Yeah. So it is quite distinctive in that regard.
And so I just wanted to ask, so, you know, George Grosz, his work kind of emerges in a very tumultuous period between the sort of First World War and the Cold War. But I was sort of interested in his relevance today, really.
I mean, on the one hand, you could say that it's not relevant at all. I mean, obviously, the kind of political physiognomy that Grosz developed in his art in the 1920s bears little resemblance to the nature of capital and labor exploitation and those sorts of things today. I mean, if you want to, I mean, I just recently watched Ken Loach's most recent film on the gig economy. I mean, this is a different world than the one that Grosz was dealing with. And, you know, even the kind of satirical caricature that he was doing, I think that still has a vitality to it, but you can see even in the United States that, like most newspapers, have removed satirical caricature from their pages. So there's very decided suppression of that kind of work going on. So it doesn't have quite the resonance and play that it used to have. But of course, we're also dealing with what I think many of us call outright for what it is, and that is resurgent fascism. It's not just in the United States, it's around the world. So the kind of risk-taking and the, he kind of put his life on the line on a number of occasions to produce work that he knew full well would land him in prison, or perhaps worse. There's a lot to be admired in that. So I think, unfortunately, we're kind of in that, it's felt like late Weimar for some time now. And I think I said when we first got together in the States here, we're witnessing the surgence. I don't know if it's is the right word, but the surgence of paramilitary organizations. I mean, it's hard not to look at Portland as today's Madrid or Barcelona. This is the staging ground for the clash of, fascism with its opposite, whatever that is. Antifa is the name that's given to it, but I think it's a lot more than just Antifa. And so people are going to Portland, and it's like the Lincoln brigades, taking off for Madrid and for Barcelona. So the major distinction now, I would say, is the awareness of environmental catastrophe. That would be the one thing that sort of changes the game for all games. It is the one factor that completely changes the equation, and it just heightens the things that we're facing now. So I think that, looking at, the times are very different, but the necessity for critical intervention on the part of artistic culture, I think, is more necessary now than it ever was, at least in my lifetime. And it's being made harder and harder to do.
Yeah.
And I feel, I'm not an artist, but I am an educator, and I feel very passionately about the work that I do in that environment, and that is becoming harder and harder to do every day. And it's.
I'm nodding a lot. I don't know if it's showing up.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a mistake. I don't think it's a mistake. I think that this is. It's not in any sort of conscious way, but it does have its cultural logic. Why do these realms of critical autonomy come under attack? And so I think in the broader sweep of things, there's a lot of parallel. So I'm really glad you're interested.
Yeah. Well, no, one of the reasons that I was interested is because it seems the story seems very relevant. Yeah. Obviously he's approaching a different time with different issues are being raised, but the story does seem like a relevant story to be thinking about today.
It startles me how many parallels I do see, and it's constantly, it's getting fleshed out more and more as the parallels mount. This, of course, this feeds into our own discussions here in the States about, will, for instance, the Bernie Sanders supporters vote Democratic this time? I hope to God they do. I would crawl over hot coals to vote for Joe Biden, even though I can't stand Joe Biden. But I cannot stomach the thought of the alternative. That would be the one thing that I would say is, like, there are a lot of people who were on the left in Germany in the late 1920s who really rue the day that they didn't strike a bond of solidarity across the left to stand up to Hitler. So it's like, you gotta hold your nose sometimes and do something just to get yourself beyond the threshold of extreme danger. I think people are pretty aware of that, but I'm not sure. I'm just not sure. It makes me worry.
I pull a lot of my classes too, just to see what's going on. It's hard to do now because everything's online. Yeah. And so if any of my students end up watching this, say something, or argue with me or something, or go to my Facebook page and see a post that hasn't miraculously disappeared. Their algorithms do not understand satire. I will say that. I had a big thing come up and I was like, are you kidding? That wasn't even a news item. And it's like, this is wrong. I was like, oh boy.
Aversiveness of satire. Yeah.
Oh yeah. It's, but it is, I think it is an interesting time. And you said something pretty important that I think it is, I see it as the last cry of sort of a group of people who want to hold on to whatever their way of life is and enforce it on everyone else. And I interviewed someone for our podcast, Radio Flom, if anyone's listening, the Croatia infiltration. And it's a guy in Croatia who's been going through Eastern Europe and just photographing stuff using film-like techniques. And I asked him how he learned it. He's like, YouTube. He did on YouTube. And we started talking about all the despots over there. And of course, there's new ones showing up. But he's like, the old ones, what happened to them? And this really stuck with me is they got old, they lost their power, and no one cares. And you have a whole generation now who doesn't care about them. So imagine 20 years from now, we're either going to have someone worse or a descendant who's figured out how to do that. Or we're going to be looking back and going, wow. And we have to wait for that to happen though. But it is pretty interesting times. There's some interesting conversations going around.
Yeah.
Too many parallels though. Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you like this and you'd like to check out more of our work, please visit www.explodingappendix.com. Exploding Appendix, ideas and culture with guts.